The gravel road into Miller Hollow hadn't been graded in 3 years, and every truck that came down it left a little more washboard behind for the next one. That was fine by Ruth Bauer. Fewer visitors meant fewer people asking why a 61-year-old widow was still running 200 acres by herself. Ruth had buried her husband Dell on a Tuesday in October, 4 years back, and by that Friday she was back out mending the hog pasture fence, because the pigs don't care that you're grieving. They'll find the gap in the wire regardless. Dell used to say Ruth had more patience than any man he'd ever met, and more stubbornness than a Missouri mule. Both were about to be tested. It started, as these things always do, with something small. A neighbor named Carl Voss pulled his truck up to the fence line one April morning while Ruth was replacing a rotted corner post. Carl farmed the section east of hers, 300 acres of soybeans and corn, and he had opinions about everything, especially about a widow trying to run a place on her own. "You know you can just buy new posts, Ruth," Carl said, leaning out his window. "Coop's got treated pine, $6 a post. Cheaper than whatever you're doing here." What Ruth was doing was pulling half-rotted cedar posts out of the ground, cutting off the punky bottom 18 inches with a chainsaw, treating the cut end with copper naphthenate, and resetting the post 2 feet deeper than it had been. It was slower than driving in a new post. It was also, in Ruth's estimation, smarter. "These posts have another 20 years in them, Carl," she said, not looking up from her work. "The rot only ever gets the bottom foot and a half, where the ground stays wet. Cedar heartwood above that is good as the day it was cut." Carl laughed, the kind of laugh men do when they think a woman is being sentimental instead of practical. "You're keeping scrap wood out of nostalgia. Dell's been gone 4 years, Ruth. The posts don't need saving. Neither do you." Ruth didn't answer that. She just kept working, and Carl drove off, and that might have been the end of it, except Carl told his wife, who told the women at the co-op, and within a month, half the township knew Ruth Bauer was the widow who wouldn't throw anything away. They called her yard the post graveyard behind her back. She had a stack of 40-some salvaged cedar posts under the lean-to by the barn, sorted by length and diameter, waiting for the day she'd need them. Here's what none of them understood, and what Ruth had learned from 38 years of marriage to a man who grew up on this land. Eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, is naturally rot-resistant because of thujaplicin compounds in the heartwood, the same chemistry that keeps cedar chests from getting eaten by moths. A cedar fence post, properly cut, can last 25 to 30 years in the ground, compared to 8 or 10 years for an untreated pine post. Even treated pine, run through a pressure vessel with chromated copper arsenate or copper azole, was only rated for 15 to 20 years and cost real money new. Ruth's salvaged posts, still good above the rot line, cost her nothing but time and a little copper naphthenate she bought in bulk from the farm store. But it wasn't really about the money, and it wasn't about nostalgia either, whatever Carl thought. It was about what Dell used to call reading the land. Dell had grown up watching his own father salvage everything, fence wire, barn tin, even old machinery parts, not because the Bauers were poor, though times had been lean, but because a farm teaches you that almost nothing is truly used up. Rot takes the outside, the heartwood holds. Ruth kept saving posts through that spring and into summer. She had help 2 days a week from her grandson Tyler, 17 years old, home from school and saving money for a truck. Tyler thought his grandmother's post pile was a little strange too, though he never said so directly. He noticed she was particular about certain things. She wanted the pile stacked off the ground on pallets, covered against rain, sorted so the 8-footers were separate from the 6.5-footers used for interior cross-fencing. She noticed things about the land too, where water pooled after a hard rain, which low spots held moisture into July, which fence lines took the worst of the prevailing wind. "Why do you keep the short ones separate, Grandma?" Tyler asked one July afternoon while they were loading posts onto the flatbed trailer. "Because when you need a short post, you need it right then," Ruth said. "You don't want to be standing in a field during a fence emergency, sorting through 8-footers looking for the one that got cut down. When's a fence emergency ever happen?" Ruth looked toward the northwest, toward the tree line, where the land started to roll down toward Miller Creek. "More often than you'd think, out here." That conversation happened on July 14th. The tornado came through 9 days later, on July 23rd, a Tuesday evening, same day of the week Dell had died. though Ruth never mentioned that to anyone and told herself it didn't mean anything. The weather that day had been strange in the particular way that farmers learn to read before the television meteorologists say a word. The morning was unusually still and warm, the air thick and green-tinted by late afternoon, the kind of green that old-timers call hail color. The barometric pressure had been dropping since noon. Ruth's Angus cattle, 42 head on the north pasture, had bunched together near the tree line around 4 o'clock, which was itself a sign. Cattle sense pressure changes and often seek low ground or shelter before storms that humans haven't even seen forming on radar yet. By 5:30, the National Weather Service in the region had issued a tornado watch for the county. By 6:15, that watch was a warning. The supercell that spawned the tornado had been tracking northeast at almost 50 miles an hour, drawing warm, moist air up from the south and cold, dry air down from the northwest. The classic wind shear setup that lets a thunderstorm's updraft start rotating, forming what meteorologists call a mesocyclone. When that rotating column tightens and drops to the ground, you get a tornado. This one touched down 4 miles southwest of Miller Hollow at 6:41 p.m. and was rated an EF3 by the survey team that came through afterward. Winds between 136 and 165 miles per hour. Ruth had the radio on in the kitchen. The old battery-powered weather radio Dell had bought back in the 90s. And when the tone alert went off, she didn't hesitate. She'd lived through 2 other close calls in her lifetime, and she knew exactly what mattered. Get people and animals to shelter, and get it done fast, because an EF3 tornado can cover 4 miles in under 5 minutes. Tyler was still at the barn. Ruth called him on his cell, told him to get to the storm cellar behind the house. The old root cellar, Dell's grandfather had dug into the hillside back when a storm cellar meant a hole in the ground with a slanted door and not much else. Ruth grabbed her 2 barn cats, shoved them into a plastic tote with holes punched in the lid, and ran for the cellar herself. They didn't get the cattle to shelter. There wasn't time, and cattle don't shelter the way people do anyway. They don't fit in a root cellar, and open pasture is often statistically safer for livestock than being caught near structures that can become flying debris. What Ruth had done, without consciously planning for a tornado specifically, was make sure her fencing was strong enough to hold if the worst happened and the herd needed to be contained afterward, in the chaos, when a scattered herd of panicked cattle on a county road could get someone killed. The tornado's exact track missed the farmhouse by half a mile, cutting instead directly across Ruth's north pasture and clipping the eastern edge of Carl Voss's property. From the cellar, Ruth and Tyler heard what everyone who has survived a tornado up close describes the same way. A sound like a freight train mixed with a waterfall, a pressure in the ears, a roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It lasted less than 90 seconds. Then it was gone, moving on toward the next township, leaving behind the strange dead calm that follows every tornado. Air suddenly still, sky suddenly lighter, the world holding its breath. When Ruth came up out of the cellar, the first thing she saw was that the old oak by the driveway, a tree that had stood since before her husband was born, was gone. Not blown over, but sheared off 8 feet up the trunk, the top 40 feet of it thrown 100 yards into the soybean field. That's typical of high-end EF3 damage. Well-built structures lose roofs and exterior walls, and mature hardwood trees are snapped, not just uprooted. The barn had lost part of its roof. The equipment shed was untouched by the strange mercy that tornadoes so often show, sparing one building while leveling another 50 feet away, a result of the tornado's narrow, erratic path and the way debris and wind vortices within the funnel behave unevenly. But the fence, nearly a half-mile of the north pasture fence, the fence Ruth had spent 2 years rebuilding post by post, was down. Not broken. Down. Posts leaning, wire slack, whole sections flattened by debris and by the straight-line winds that always surround a tornado's core. Cattle don't stay put when a fence goes down, especially not spooked cattle after a tornado. Ruth's herd had scattered through the gap, some of them already a quarter-mile off, across Carl Voss's flattened soybean field, drawn toward the county road, where 3 vehicles had already had to slow down for wandering. Panicked Angus steers in the dark. This is where the post pile mattered. Carl Voss showed up at Ruth's place an hour after the storm passed, not to gloat. There wasn't a person left in the township who was gloating that night. but because his own fences were down too, and his own cattle mixed in with hers along the shared boundary, and he needed help, and he needed it now, in the dark, with a flashlight and a spool of wire, and whatever posts anyone could find. Coop's supply of treated pine posts was 15 miles away and closed for the night regardless. New posts, even if you could get them, would take a full day to arrive. Ruth had 40-some cedar posts, already cut, already treated, already sorted by length, sitting dry under the lean-to, exactly where she'd need them. They worked through the night. Tyler ran the tractor with a post-hole auger attachment when the ground allowed it, and where the ground was too torn up with debris for the auger, Ruth and Carl set posts by hand, the way it had been done for 150 years on that land, digging with a spade and a post-hole digger, tamping the fill dirt in 6-inch layers.